You will be able to interact in the chat, as many of you already are. You can see the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can also ask questions by using the Q&A. We're not going to use the raising hand feature today because we have so many people joining us. We have over 400 people signed up for this webinar. So thank you for your time and attention today, and your involvement is really what's going to make the difference in terms of securing real climate protections this year. So first, let me review our agenda. I'm going to provide a quick overview of the policy landscape in terms of climate action and what we see as our top opportunities this year to secure significant climate protections. Next, you're going to hear from Jonathan Laycott-Nisley, IPL's Federal Policy Associate, on legislative opportunities. And then he'll pass the baton to Bill Bradley, IPL's Organizing Director, to share the top administrative, that is EPA and Department of Interior opportunities for action. Last but not least, we'll hear from Tiffany Hartung, IPL's Field Director, who will share some of the strategies and tactics we have in mind and how you can participate. Afterward, we're going to have plenty of time for a discussion and Q&A. At that point, or even before, as I mentioned, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question or to make a comment. You're all muted now. We do have a big audience, and really pleased to have you all with us today. We have more than 400 folks register for this webinar. Many of you are watching live. Welcome also to those watching the recording. And rest assured, we will be sharing the recording later, so don't feel that you have to take copious notes as you watch and listen today. And we do plan to wrap up within the hour in time for lunch on the West Coast. Now, I'd like to ask that we just take a moment right now, if we could have a moment of silence to acknowledge the passing last week of an extraordinary spiritual leader, Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh was a Buddhist monk, peace activist, an environmentalist, an internationally renowned teacher and author. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King in 1967 for his work against the Vietnam War. He was a leader in the Zen Buddhist tradition, but I know many of us are familiar with his work, learned from him. He encouraged his students and readers to go deeper into their own faith traditions and define the common core of all faiths, a call to greater love and compassion for each other. Just two examples of his books are Living Buddha, Living Christ, and Love Letter to the Earth, which I'm reading right now and highly recommend. If we could just take a moment to remember this extraordinary soul as he passes into the next plane. Thank you. Thank you, and blessings on your journey, Ty. Your memory is a blessing. So where are we at this moment? In January 2022, as we all know, we have yet to pass our #1 climate priority, the Build Back Better Act, which has been stymied in the Senate since late last year when Senator Joe Manchin said he could not support it, and brought all of our hopes for a comprehensive climate package in time for Christmas to a crashing halt. We're going to hear more about that later, but I do want to recognize that we had some real achievements last year. We got billions of dollars secured for clean energy and for safe drinking water. We secured a new clean car standards that is going to cut emissions 30%, and a national clean energy and a national target of cutting global warming pollution at least in half by 2030. That was announced by President Biden in April. Sorry, I wasn't visible before. I just realized that. Hello, everyone. And another major victory in the infrastructure bill is something many of us worked on for years, funding for restoration of degraded coal mining lands and waters. And we got $11 billion in the infrastructure bill for that, which will also create thousands of jobs in environmental restoration and cleanup. Still, we know there is much more to do to make a safe climate a real possibility in our future, in our children's future. And the good news is there are some significant policy opportunities in sight this year. The top 4 climate policies we see, the top 4 opportunities for this year are the Build Back Better Act. Again, with its climate provisions intact, is probably going, it will definitely be changed, it will be revised, it will be smaller, but we want to keep at most, if not all, of the important climate provisions that are in there that surprisingly seem to be the least controversial part. Another alternative is a standalone climate bill, also passed through the reconciliation process, so with a majority vote of senators. Second is federal voting rights protection. The Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act sadly failed last week to surmount the filibuster challenge in the Senate, but there will be other opportunities for voting rights protection. Methane emissions from oil and gas wells and infrastructure, getting mandatory emissions limits in place for the very potent greenhouse gas methane that's leaking out of oil and gas wells and infrastructure and pipelines all over this country. And fourth, as I think I mentioned before, new standards to limit emissions from the nation's power plants. And we're expecting EPA rules on that to come out this summer. So whenever we see an important opportunity on any of these priorities, we will let you know, whether it's signing a petition, writing a letter, speaking at an EPA hearing, attending a rally, or meeting with your elected representatives. Your action and activism makes a difference. I believe we can look forward to a year of climate progress. It's going to be tough, but I believe we have some significant opportunities in front of us. So with no further ado, I will pass it over to Jonathan Laycock-Nisley, IPL's Federal Policy Associate, to tell us a little bit more about our legislative priorities. And again, if you have questions, please go ahead and feel free to put those in the Q&A.
Thanks, Susan. It's good to be with you all. Yeah, so I'm going to run through our priorities for this year, talk a little more about what we accomplished this past year, but I want to start by grounding us in our faith principles, this acronym that we worked on last year with about 24 other national religious organizations who work on environmental issues. So I'll just run through them quickly. And this is the focus for our work and what we look for in the legislation that we support. So our work centers frontline, vulnerable, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. We call for the acceleration of the transition to a clean energy economy and commit to net zero climate pollution in electricity by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050. We want to see legislation that invests in climate resiliency and sustainable infrastructure. And especially as the faith community, we think it's important to support a transition for our workforce to clean energy jobs with support and job training for workers, especially in the fossil fuel industry. Finally, we can honor creation by promoting protection and conservation of public lands and oceans. And if we go to the next slide, you can see those 24 national organizations that signed on in support of these principles. You'll see many denominational bodies, US governing bodies for different religious groups. So you can see if your own faith tradition is on there, and it can be a helpful starting point for these conversations in your congregations, I think, too. So coming out of these principles, certainly, you know, Susan talked about the Build Back Better Act being stalled, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But there were two really exciting big pieces of legislation that passed last year, neither specifically focused on the climate, but with some key provisions for the climate and for environmental justice included. The first was the American Rescue Plan, the last in the series of COVID relief bills. And that legislation included what we and many environmental groups had been pushing for, $100 million for environmental justice grants and monitoring. So this is for the communities who bear the biggest burden of pollution, because we know that that unfair burden of pollution makes people's lungs more vulnerable to COVID-19. And so this environmental justice grants program that we had been calling for a long time is more essential than ever in the face of a pandemic. It also included $4.5 billion for LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which is the federal program that helps people pay their utility bills, keep the lights and the heat on. And then finally, it included $30 billion for public transit, because so many of our public transit systems were hurting with the loss of revenue, the loss of riders in the past year. That funding through the American Rescue Plan kept them moving and kept them in a position to come out of the pandemic, hopefully stronger than ever. The other big piece of legislation that passed last year was the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And so I want to be very clear that this is not a piece of climate legislation. It is primarily a bill that funds things like roads and bridges, which is certainly important. It's not the climate bill we've been waiting for, but it does have several important provisions. Like Susan mentioned, it has that $11 billion to clean up abandoned mine lands, which is really exciting. We had been pushing the Reclaim Act for many years, which, the big win was going to be $1 billion to clean up abandoned mine lands, and this has 11 times that amount. There's funding for cleaning up other kinds of legacy pollution Superfund sites as well. The infrastructure bill also has funding to expand Amtrak service, starting new routes. It has some funding for clean drinking water. Our top priority on clean drinking water had been removing every lead pipe across the country, because we know far too many communities still get the tap water in their house through lead service lines, which is an environmental disaster and a huge justice issue. The infrastructure bill included about a quarter of the funding needed to remove those lead pipes. And so that's one of the many reasons we continue to push for the Build Back Better Act, because it has the remaining money to get that job done. And then the last two in the infrastructure bill, investments in the electrical grid to help our grid be more ready for more clean energy, more wind and solar, and funding for new electric vehicle charging stations across the country. So we can go to the next slide. And as Susan mentioned, and as I'm sure you are all aware, talks are stalled right now on the Build Back Better Act. In December, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia announced that he could not support the legislation as currently written. And because the Senate is in a 50-50 split right now, and because Republicans have shown no interest in negotiating on this legislation, the Democrats need to be totally united to pass it through the budget reconciliation process. That was a really disappointing announcement, but we feel encouraged that President Biden has said it remains at the top of his agenda. Senate leadership has said they will be returning to it very shortly to continue work. And so we feel encouraged that we can still get something passed this year. And as Susan said, Senator Manchin has indicated that the climate provisions are actually one of the closest pieces for him right now. There have been negotiations for so long that he feels the climate piece is close to something he can support. So we can go to the next slide, and I just want to run through again these key pieces in the climate and environmental justice provisions of the Build Back Better Act. So the Build Back Better Act first has big investments in clean electricity. It would extend and expand tax credits for wind and solar power. These are the tax credits that over the past decade have helped, turn wind and solar from an interesting idea to an everyday source of electricity in the US. And we need to invest in them if we're going to meet that goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035. I mentioned clean water. Like I said, the Build Back Better Act would finish the job that the infrastructure bill started by providing the funding to remove every single lead water pipe in the US. The Build Back Better Act has funding for electric vehicle tax credits. So the infrastructure bill had electric vehicle charging stations. The Build Back Better Act has the tax credits that can help make electric vehicles more accessible to average families, including even a tax credit for used electric vehicles, which is really important given the price of all new vehicles right now. And it has funding for public transit, both helping municipalities put in new public transit service and electrifying the transit service that already exists. The Build Back Better Act, one of the ways that it pays for its climate provisions, and also an important climate provision in its own right, is a fee on methane pollution. So methane gas is a climate super polluter with, in the short term, about 80 times the warming power of carbon dioxide. And often during drilling operations or in the fracking process, some methane is vented or flared directly into the atmosphere. This would put a price on that pollution, incentivizing drillers to capture that methane instead and stopping, this climate super polluter, which there's no real reason to be venting that straight into the atmosphere. And finally, the Build Back Better Act has a number of important environmental justice provisions. There's more funding for those environmental justice grants that I mentioned earlier that let communities identify pollution sources in their own communities and apply for federal dollars to help them get the job done. And many, many other small programs that collectively add up to a big investment in the communities that deserve it most. So that's the Build Back Better Act. That's the climate provisions. Our other top legislative priority for the year, and we can go to the next slide, is voting rights. There were two big bills on voting rights. They've now been combined in the Senate into one, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. So this in broad categories does two big things. First, it sets federal standards for elections in ways that they haven't been set before. So national standards for voter registration, for early voting and voting by mail. And it also tries to stop states from putting in restrictions that are designed to keep people from voting. And we know that's especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, students, and other groups. So it restores some of the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to stop states from putting in new discriminatory policies. It also bans partisan gerrymandering, stops the practice of politicians choosing their voters rather than voters choosing politicians. And it brings dark money into the light, which is one of the many reasons that voting rights is such an important climate issue. We know that we can't have a healthy climate without a healthy democracy. So many of these issues that we talked about with the Build Back Better Act are wildly popular. They pull so strongly across the country. But the power of money from fossil fuels, the power of these gerrymandered districts that deprive people of their voice in Congress is a lot to overcome. And so we are intentionally bridging the gap and making the connection between these two issues this year. As Susan said, this bill also suffered a setback last week when Senate Democrats were unable to pass changes to the filibuster. We're still waiting for more instruction from our partners who work most closely on voting rights about the next steps, but we'll be sure to keep you informed. So yes, please drop your questions into the Q&A feature, and I will pass it along to Bill Bradley.
Thanks, Jonathan. Welcome, everyone. Hey, thanks for joining today. I want to talk to you briefly and explain what we mean by administrative priorities. So Jonathan spoke about legislation. With administrative priorities, we're referring to specific rules that are created by agencies like the EPA through authority granted by Congress. These rules, and sometimes we refer to them as regulations, as standards or safeguards, have the force of law, and the agencies have to follow certain steps to ensure public participation and consistent procedures, and that's where we can come in. So here are some highlights of our administrative priorities and also some recent successes. So looking at cars, the first slide up here talks about how transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gases in the US right now. The EPA, the good news is the EPA has taken steps to tackle the country's leading source of carbon pollution, the transportation sector. In late 2021, the EPA finalized federal greenhouse gas emission standards for passenger cars and light trucks for model years 2023 through 2026. The final standards reduce climate pollution, improve public health, and save drivers money at the pump. So definitely good news there. Now the Biden administration has an opportunity to quickly start the next round of clean car standards. So that'll be for model years 2027 and beyond. And it's really important that we push and encourage the administration to move quickly with these next model year standards to further incentivize the automakers to rapidly move towards electric vehicles. Additionally, I want to say that we expect an announcement, it could be really any day, that will reinstate states' authorities promised under the Clean Air Act to adopt stronger than federal vehicle pollution standards. And this is really critical because California and now 16 other states have adopted these standards, and these too push the auto industry to move more rapidly towards cleaner cars. And you can see in this next image here, a drop off to the EPA, that's the EPA building in the background, EPA Administrator Michael Regan in the center, and IPL President Reverend Susan Hendershot on the left in blue, dropping off comments to the EPA about cleaner cars. So moving on to methane, as Jonathan said, what some call natural gas. It's mostly methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's actually responsible for about 1/4 of the global warming that we're experiencing today. Far too much of this is leaking from oil and gas operations, and this is dangerous, it's unhealthy, and it's just plain wasteful. The EPA recently released new rules that cut down on methane pollution. These rules finally apply to both new and existing sources of methane. So methane, oil and gas industry that's being created now, as well as that has been created in the past. This is a vital step because so many of us spoke up in the past year and demanded truly strong methane safeguards. With the help of many IPL supporters, we delivered comments, just like with the clean cars. We also delivered powerful hearing and testimonies from people of faith and conscience. And now we have one more chance to comment on these final EPA rules and to make them even stronger. And I see someone dropped the link into the chat, so take a look at that. This is our alert to comment on the EPA final rule for methane. And the comment period ends at the end of this month on the 31st. So we need to get all of the comments in by that point. And we expect that there is a good chance for this rule, even though it's final, to even be strengthened, because the EPA is looking to issue a supplemental proposal that will expand on this 2021 proposal in response to these comments that are coming in right now. Also, I want to mention that we're expecting a BLM draft methane rule this year. So that would be a methane that's specifically oil and gas operations on BLM, Bureau of Land Management land. And we'll be working on that and letting people know when there's an opportunity to act. I do want to say, well, the best and most just solution to the climate crisis is to fully transition away from fossil fuels and embrace a clean energy economy. Reducing methane waste right now from leaking and flaring will reduce harm to frontline communities living within oil and gas development areas and also curb further climate change. So it's important that we do both. Moving on to power plants, about 25% of the US greenhouse gas emissions coming from power plants. We're hoping for a strong rule that will reduce emissions from electricity generation. We want to really focus on that this year. But before that can happen, we need to see how the Supreme Court rules next month. In the lawsuit currently pending before the Supreme Court, 19 states led by West Virginia argued that the EPA does not have the authority to enact the Obama-era Clean Power Plan. The hearing is expected on February 28th, and we need to see what happens and where that leads us. Once that's over, we hope the court rules in a way that will allow the Biden EPA to create a new rule to more rapidly reduce climate change pollution from power plants. And again, that's going to be a central focus for IPL this coming year. Then I just want to quickly touch on a couple of other things that are important related to climate, but very important for public health and justice. And these are things that we also expect we'll be working on. Ozone and particulate matter. So we're expecting a draft rule in the summer of this year of 2022 for particulate matter, and we're expecting a draft rule in the spring of 2023 for ozone. And just to give a very quick background here, because this gets complicated very fast, but ozone, we think of the stuff way up in the stratosphere in the air, that's good. The ozone layer protects us from harmful UV radiation. But the ground level ozone is bad. It's mostly the result of reactions of volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides. When inhaled, it reacts chemically in our respiratory tract, and it leads to a lot of bad health effects. So it's a real problem and increasingly known to be a problem. Similarly, particulate matter, what we're talking about is what they call PM 2.5, fine inhalable particles with diameters that are generally 2.5 micrometers and smaller. But you say, what's 2.5 micrometers? Well, here's an example. The average human hair is about 60 or 70 micrometers, and we're talking about particles that are 2.5. So they're incredibly tiny, but they come from sources like unpaved roads, smokestacks, and fires. And you can see in this picture that I've given, we look at increasing forest fires due to climate change, and these are then a contributor to this particulate matter that we're dealing with. These are incredibly bad, and we're discovering, the science is continuing to discover just how dangerous these fine particulate matter can be to human health. It's not something that we want to be breathing. So that's a lot of information. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this webinar, and I will pass it along to Tiffany.
Thanks, Bill. So I'm going to share and advance the slides there. I'm going to share some of the ways that you and your faith community can help advance these policies that we've covered today. Obviously, some of them are much farther out in the future, but we have some initial ways that you can help support now and over the next couple of months. Later in the year, you'll definitely hear from us around some of those other opportunities, for specifically some of the EPA rules that Bill mentioned. So as Jonathan mentioned, it's important right now, we need to keep up a drumbeat to show support for the Build Back Better Act now through April. So be on the lookout for a chance to reinforce in district support for climate action with your members of Congress. A lot of them are holding town halls right now, virtual town halls, and it's important for them to hear from people of faith that we need them to act now and act quickly on Build Back Better. Additionally, this Thursday is a National Day of Action. The climate community is driving emails and calls into Senate offices on the 27th, Thursday. So Susan is dropping in the chat a link for call-in information, as well as a link that you can share with your faith community on social media or in an email or any other ways of communication that your community uses. And then also a link that you can share to encourage people to email their senators. on this priority. Another tactic that's in IPL's wheelhouse is congregation tours, or tours of cool congregations. The idea is that to host a tour for members of Congress, along with a reporter or two, of a cool congregation. These are, a lot of your congregations are probably cool congregation certified, or have solar congregations that have updated and made efficiency and environmental improvements to your houses of worship or congregation structures. So it's great to show those off to our members of Congress. So the idea is to invite them and some select reporters, and it's a great photo op for our members of Congress, and a chance for that congregation to share with them how their actions that they made are motivated by their values of caring for our common home and future generations, and then call on our members of Congress to demonstrate the same climate leadership in Congress. So several IPL affiliates did some of these tours last year, and including the DC, Maryland, Virginia IPL. And so I'm going to tap Jonathan here again to share a little bit about one that they did with Senator Warner's office last fall. And there's some pictures here, as you can see from that tour.
Yeah, so with our local IPL affiliate in DC and Northern Virginia, we had Senator Warner's staffer come out and tour Peace Lutheran Church in Alexandria. And I think this is such a great opportunity because, I'm guessing as I ran through all those policy details in Build Back Better, it was probably hard to conceptualize what it all meant in the real world. That's true for the legislators who are writing these bills too. It can just kind of be words on a page until you see what it actually looks like in your community. And I think that's where these congregational tours can help. So sometimes it's direct. Peace Lutheran has solar panels on their roof, and we talked with the staff person about how the Build Back Better Act would help more people of faith go solar. Sometimes it can be more representative. Workers in their garden, which provides food for the local community, talked about how clean water is essential for their gardening, and tied that to the Build Back Better Act, funding lead pipe removal and ensuring clean water for more communities. So I think there's just a lot of room to be creative and to help not just our faith communities, but also these legislators themselves imagine more fully the impact that this legislation can have.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was a great event, and so fun to see Peace Lutheran, see the pictures from Peace Lutherans. I think they tweeted them out, and we tweeted them, and IPL DMV tweeted them and tagged Senator Warner. So it was a great event. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Faithful Advocacy Captains program that we have. I think many of you are probably on that email list or members of it already. But as we've been growing our Faithful Climate movement, IPL has begun to engage our supporters more in helping advance federal policy with our Faithful Advocacy Captains program. And so I just want to share it again for those of you who are not familiar with it. Captains sign up to serve as a liaison between IPL and their congregations or their broader faith community on federal policy. And we hope that this is ensuring that Congress and the administration is hearing from the faith community on climate justice and the need to act. So we'll drop the link in the chat so you can learn more about this program or sign up if you'd like to receive updates. And now I will turn it back to Susan to facilitate our question and discussion section. I see lots of questions have been coming in.
Thank you. Thanks, Tiffany. And thank you, Madison Mayhew, who is behind the scenes. She is our newest staff member, our federal policy advocate, and she is helping to collate your questions and make sure we get the most popular questions in for discussion here. I also want to say that I think our presenters did a great job kind of connecting the dots between how we set our policies, our policy priorities to center both climate impact and also equity and justice. I feel that's a really important role that we play in the faith community, is highlighting that equity and justice piece of this. Let's see, we have some questions, a number of questions. One thing I just noticed I wanted to start with, because this is something we've talked about recently. It's kind of a messaging question for Bill about administrative policy of methane and natural gas emissions. Should we be calling it fossil gas, or what does natural gas sound too positive for what we're talking about?
Yeah, so I responded to that in the chat, but we refer to it as methane pollution. I think that's a good, accurate name, and kind of gets to the point. I do often talk about natural gas and make the connection, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily make that connection between methane and natural gas being virtually the same thing. So I think it's helpful to make that connection for people so that they understand that stove that they're turning on, natural gas, is methane, and how serious that is for climate. But that's the terminology that we focus on, is methane pollution.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Then there's a question about the faith principles, and I thank you all for, many of you played a role in getting your faith tradition signed onto those faith principles. We're much more effective when we work together in coalition with other faith organizations and environmental organizations. And we had over 24 faith organizations sign on to the principles. So kind of grounding us all in these shared priorities that we can advance together. And there was a question about how can we get our faith tradition to sign on to those principles if they haven't already. And I think that Tiffany may have shared a link in the chat, but Jonathan, could you share whether it's too late, or is there still a chance for people to ask their own denomination or faith organization to endorse those principles?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done a push for more signers since last year, but I think we would be happy to add more names to that list, and we could talk about, more names, more organizations joining in our meetings with legislators where we share those principles. So if you are in a position to ask your national organization or your faith traditions denominational body to sign on, we would love to have them. I can put my email into the chat.
It's really helpful, and for them to hear from you, so they know that people in their denomination and their faith tradition care about this issue and want to see coalition action. And it also helps, I think, when we have specific bills, specific legislation, specific policies to advance, if that religious tradition can see, oh, we already supported this principle. So it's easier for them, I think, to make the jump to endorsing a bill and working on a piece of legislation. So I think that's still useful. Let's see, back to methane. We have a question about why is it a methane fee in the Build Back Better Act? Do you know, Jonathan, why the mechanism of a fee instead of a tax or a cap and trade?
Sure. So it's a great question. I think it might have come in before Bill's section. The idea is that this fee works hand in hand with the rules that the EPA and the Bureau of Land Management are putting in place. So it's coming at it from both directions, both rules to limit pollution and then a price on the pollution that remains to keep moving it down even further.
Okay, great. Thank you. How about the prior, this is a question about the filibuster. How did the prior administration get legislation through? Would why did the John Lewis Voter Act, they want to know, require a filibuster? Jonathan, could you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. So this is the weird arcane Senate rules. The filibuster requires 60 votes to end debate. Oh, am I? Yes. Okay. I thought I was muted for a second. The filibuster requires 60 votes to end debate and move forward on passing legislation. But there's a special provision for passing budgetary legislation. So if something is deemed to be mostly about the budget and policy effects are only incidental, is the language, then it can be passed with a simple majority. And so that is how the tax cuts under Trump were passed, because they were mostly about the budget. So they could be passed with the simple Republican majority. And that is the same mechanism that Build Back Better is using to try to pass. All of these provisions are about adding, well, they're mostly about adding money to existing programs, which is how they are able to pass with a simple majority vote. But the voting rights legislation is not about the budget. It's specifically about policy. And so that is still subject to the filibuster. Democrats have the power to change the filibuster. You know, they could make it so that legislation can pass with a simple majority, but they've so far not been able to get the votes to do that.
All right, thank you. Yes, very frustrating when we can't pass voting rights with a majority vote. Bill, I want to ask a little bit about the EPA hearings that are coming up. Well, first of all, we had a question about what is the top source of climate pollution in our country? And I think we know it's transportation. Could you talk a little bit about how the Clean Cars rule will address that? How much will it reduce climate pollution? And do we know when any upcoming hearings might be?
I can't answer that one off the top of my head. I would have to look that up to see how much it will reduce. Obviously, because transportation is the #1 source, you know, it's a priority for us. We're really looking for all of the places where we can get the most impact for our effort. In terms of upcoming hearings, you know, as I mentioned, one of the things that we want to be working on is getting the model year 2027 and beyond and trying to get that moving quickly. So that's something that we'll be looking at working on in the coming months. There's also work that's happening now around, we, as I mentioned, worked on light duty vehicles. So that's your cars, your SUVs, smaller pickup trucks, but there's heavy duty vehicle work that's happening now that we're engaged a little bit in. And I'm happy to pass along information to people about that work and what they can do.
Okay, and do we have any dates for any upcoming hearings? EPA or otherwise?
Nothing immediate, nothing off the top of my head. You know, those are things where typically you're going to have hearings where there's a chance for people to testify. And now with virtual, I mean, the one small blessing of that is it allows people all around the country to be able to attend those hearings rather than people just in a few cities. So we definitely will keep people informed when those opportunities arise. And then after the testimony, there is typically a comment period that lasts 30, 60, or 90 days. And we always let people know when those opportunities are for them to comment.
Yes, we do. And I see a question about trucks, and I think that the Clean Cars rule that we just secured addresses light duty vehicles. Is that right, Bill? So it wouldn't be heavy duty trucks yet?
Correct.
So light duty vehicles means cars and SUVs. Okay, that will be an important thing to watch. I also see a question about power plants. The EPA will be promulgating regulations to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, but there'll be an important Supreme Court ruling on this issue and what authority the EPA has. Can you tell us anything more about that, about the timing around that Supreme Court case, Bill?
Well, my understanding is that the Supreme Court is hearing it on February 28th. So then, the amount of time exactly that the hearings will happen with the Supreme Court, for weeks or a couple months after that. And then we expect sometime in the spring to hear a decision from the Supreme Court. At that point, we have to assess and see what we can do, depending on how the Supreme Court rules. It might provide a complete opportunity for us to work on power plant rules, a partial, or perhaps nothing. And that's part of the reason that we're looking at things like ozone and particulate matter, because those are connected to climate. They're certainly very impactful of public health and important things that we want to be ready to work on as well.
And do we have any sense of how strong the power plant rules might be? We know that the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration would have essentially phased out coal burning power plants. Will that be the direction that new rules will go, or we're still waiting to see?
I haven't heard much detail about that. I mean, I certainly expect so, and I expect, given the fact that the Obama Clean Power Plan that really never went into effect, we've kind of surpassed that without even having the rule go into effect. So, I think we can be looking at something stronger, but I haven't heard any details about, kind of where that will go.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about advocacy, because we know all of these policies, to get them and to secure them, we are going to need to make our voices heard. So we need all of you to stay involved and to get your faith communities involved, to share action alerts and petitions with your friends and colleagues, and really make sure that we're heard loud and clear. We know from polling, as Jonathan said, that these policies we are advocating for are extremely popular amongst voters of all political persuasions. We have the support for the climate elements of the Build Back Better bill at like a plus 38% advantage in polling. So we've got huge support for these policies, and we just need to make sure that we put the muscle behind them and make sure that we're not shy about telling our legislators, our representatives, that we want them to act and we expect them to act. And this is really going to be a critical year to do that. In some ways, this is could be our last chance for a number of years to get legislative action. Because of the makeup of the Congress and what's happening with elections and gerrymandering. So what about highlighting our congregations? I love the idea of showing off the green infrastructure that we have in our congregations around the country, leading by example and inviting our representatives to see that. What kind of evidence do we have, Tiffany, that this works, that this can make a difference?
Yeah, I'm not sure we have evidence, but we definitely have, it's definitely, I would say, most elected officials welcome a photo op, to have a photo op with a congregation in their district. And also, I think they like to get out and do like to see these examples in their district. And then then it also gives them an example of something that they can point to when talking about the policy. They can talk about, well, I was just at Peace Lutheran Church in Alexandria and I saw their solar panels. And this is an example of what we all need to be doing, and we need public support to do this more, that kind of thing. So I think we do see we do see elected officials incorporating our messaging and giving these examples about things that faith communities are doing when we've engaged with them. So I think it's worth doing. And then certainly any media coverage that is generated from that is something that we can continue to amplify within our communities, and something that they can also amplify on social media.
Great, thank you. Yes, we have definitely, and I've heard from legislators when we've met with them, including Speaker Pelosi, that she loves seeing what the faith community is doing, and she likes to highlight that with her colleagues. It's seen as something that crosses partisan divides, I think. So the more that we can highlight faith communities are living this out, are leading by example, and we're putting these solutions in place, putting solar on our rooftops, and making our buildings energy efficient, and measuring our carbon footprint, and cutting our emissions in half. We have a national goal now, a national target, thanks to President Biden, that our country will cut our greenhouse gas emissions at least in half by the end of this decade. Many of our congregations are already there. So hopefully we provide some positive peer pressure. If we can do this in our faith communities now already in 2022, surely our country can do that by 2030. And we also have congregations that are zero carbon already. So please let us know when your congregation makes important improvements and tracks your progress. We'd love to highlight your congregation, and also let your legislators, your congresspeople know what you're doing. Okay, well, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. If you haven't put yours in yet, please go ahead and do that. I guess I'll ask this question to Tiffany. Tiffany, you've been involved with some of our partner organizations doing democracy work. What are some of the other organizations that we've been working with that you find effective at advocating for voting rights and democracy protection?
Sure. I saw that question, and I tried to answer that in the Q&A. I'm not sure I have a specific organization to mention, but I would say that we are part of a couple of different coalitions that are leading on this effort. One is Faithful Democracy Coalition, which is faith-based groups, which makes a lot of sense. And then there's also a couple of other ones that are sort of coalitions that have sort of coalesced the movements and are leading. One is called the Declaration for American Democracy. And the other one is Protect Democracy. So both those groups are sort of taking the lead on coordinating groups and taking the lead on strategy around those. And so they're great ones to follow.
Great, thank you. Just looking at the comments here. Yes, Union of Concerned Scientists is also a great source. And on the democracy work, I'll also add Common Cause is a really strong organization to look to for leadership there. Okay. So let me just ask of our panelists, do you have anything else you would like to add that you didn't get a chance to say before we wrap up?
Well, I saw several questions about electrification. And so there were kind of two pieces of the question. One was around the metals, rare earth minerals that are needed for batteries. And Bill answered that in the chat. It's an important piece of the equation. And I don't think we have a really good answer across the board yet. But the other piece of that question is about how clean is it to use electric products right now when we still have a dirty grid. So electric vehicles, electric heat pumps for our homes instead of gas furnaces. And the answer to that is that even with our current grid, which needs to be cleaner, electric appliances and vehicles are almost always cleaner than their fossil fuel equivalents. So that's an impact we can have right now. And the other piece is, of course, we're working to clean up our grid and working for a future where, we have 100% clean electricity and we have a fully electrified economy. So we're kind of moving this piece of electrification along, even while we're still doing the work of cleaning up our grid.
Thank you. Yes, and that is something we can do in our households, in our houses of worship right now. We can electrify, especially as we replace appliances, stoves. I saw Betsy King mention stovetops, gas that is used in cooking is one of the major sources of interior air pollution. So look into changing those out. Water heaters as well. And Bill, did you have something else to add on that?
No, I was just really echo what Jonathan said. I dropped a link in the chat that I thought was very good as far as, the issue of batteries in particular, but other renewables and the metals and materials that they need are an important issue that we need to look at. I mean, we can't turn a blind eye to that. We have to consider the justice issues there. We have to be pushing on recycling, which is happening and moving rapidly. But from what I'm seeing about that, there is good news, and that link that I shared really goes into a deep dive about what some of that good news is in terms of being able to recycle the materials that we need and access those materials.
Thank you. All right. Well, that I think will be a wrap. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. We will try and answer them by email. If you would like to email Tiffany at interfaithpowerandlight.org with any follow-up questions. And as I said, we will be sharing the video and the slides out from this discussion. Thank you for being a part of this today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your activism going forward this year. It's going to be a big one. So have a good day, everyone.